I'm very
Hello.
excited about this panel. So I'm just going to do just
Hello.
a quick hello to everybody. So a very big welcome to Joe O'Brien, Sarah Vohra, Kimberly Wilson, and Kieran Kennedy.
Hello.
We are going to be
Hi all.
talking about mental health matters. So we're excited about this one. This is something that's I think close to all of our hearts as well. Something that we've talked about a lot on our podcast, and I think on all of our individual social medias as well. So it's been something that we're all particularly interested in, and I think something that our audience is particularly interested in as well. So to start off with this, I think what would be really interesting would be to just go around all of our guests and ask you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what your practice is in terms of mental health, of what you do in mental health, and how that practice has changed in what we keep referring to as recent times. And I think we all know what we mean about that. So can I start with you, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Joe O'Brien. I'm a trainee health psychologist. I'm based in Dublin. What I do is one-to-one and group behavior change interventions related to health-related behaviors. So I kind of look at the psychological factors that might influence somebody's ability to change a behavior or to manage a health-related behavior. And I don't know if you want me to dive straight in, but what I've noticed in my own practice is people come to me, there's a huge increase in those health related, maybe behavioral coping strategies, things like the food, the smoking, alcohol consumption, things like that. So that's what I've noticed in my own practice during these recent times, as you say.
Awesome. And how has it kind of changed for you? Like, how are you managing to practice? Because I guess normally, like, the therapeutic relationship with people is usually a very, very kind of face-to-face thing. What's changed with
Yeah,
that for you?
and it's so important as well. So the therapeutic relationship is one of the best predictors of how well somebody's going to do in therapy or in their interventions. It has changed massively because everything's gone online. So you lose something there. But in terms of, I guess it's the best we can manage right now. I know Ireland have announced their lockdown strategy, or their how they're easing their restrictions. And one of those things is the mental health professionals are getting back into practice from the 18th of May. So at least that's somewhat beneficial for the public, I guess.
Cool. And Kimberly, next, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Kimberly Wilson. I am a chartered counselling psychologist. I also have a master's in nutrition where I focused exclusively really on the role of nutrients on the structure and function of the brain. And so much of my work really sits at that overlap between food and psychology, as well as lifestyle factors. And so that includes things like disordered eating and disordered relationships with food, including eating disorders, as well as our emotional relationship with food, and I think we all have one of those, and also thinking about things like functional disorders of the gut-brain axis, so particularly IBS, where I kind of sit there in that Venn diagram of food and psychology. And so all of my clinical work is one-to-one at the moment. I don't do any group work. And yes, I've had to move and transition my entire clinic practice online, which, though it isn't ideal, and I was quite anxious that the kind of quality of the relationship and the quality of the work would drop. Actually, it's been okay, and I've certainly been impressed both with how the technology has held up, but also how the clients have held up and how well people are doing. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity, because I think it would be quite difficult if we had to just have this ambiguous hiatus from clinical work, and people just had to kind of hold on until we got back to normal.
Absolutely. Sarah.
Hello. So
Hello.
My name's Sarah Vohra. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. So my day job, I work full-time for the NHS, and I work predominantly with children and young people. I've chose that area of expertise because there's evidence that 75% of all mental illness symptoms will have appeared before the age of 24. So actually it's really crucial that you make that difference in the early years to prevent the impact in later life. And I realised very early on in my clinical practice, I can only make a small difference with the people I see in clinic. So coupled with the fact that there's so much misinformation online, I set about creating the My Medic platform to share tips, to debunk myths around mental health, and just to really give people practical tools and tips to manage their mental well-being every day.
Oh, thank you. And Kieran.
Yes, yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming.
So I am Kieran Kennedy, so I'm a psychiatry registrar, we call them in Australia. I'm in Melbourne, Australia at the moment. And so that means I'm completing my training to become a consultant psychiatrist, and I'm about 6 months shy of that. And my specialist area of training within that is what we call consultation liaison psychiatry. So it's that real interface between physical health and mental health, and that's what I'm really passionate about. So it's seeing patients on the surgical wards and the medical wards and in the emergency department who maybe have a neurological condition or some kind of physical illness that's causing or interacting with their mental health. And so that's kind of what I'm doing day to day. And then I'm also still doing the junior doc grind in terms of doing night shifts and weekends in the emergency department, seeing people from all walks of life for any presentation at all. So people in crisis or drug and alcohol issues, or people just wanting medication or diagnosis advice. So yeah, it's busy, and it's remained quite busy over the last few months with everything going on, which has been really interesting to see how it's sort of changed here with everything to do with COVID.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And I know that one thing that you probably won't mention is that I think as of today, you've also become a Men's Health Australia cover model as well. Is that correct?
Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up, mate. I'm going to go bright red now. Yes, yeah. So I do, that aside, I do quite a bit of, I guess, mental health advocacy work over here in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm really passionate about kind of bringing down stigma around mental health issues, particularly for men and particularly in the fitness world. I've got a bit of a personal passion for that as well. So yeah, so that's what I get up to in my spare time.
Awesome. And I'm just going to echo something that Kimberly said as well, because obviously, like, working as a GP, I've also found that, you know, most of our consultations have gone online and over the telephone and video consultations. And this is something that historically I took a really dim view of when it came to mental health. So when people would ring up with mental health concerns, like on telephone consultations, I would always be very rigid that no, this is something that we need to sort out face to face. We'll book you in, we'll bring you in, we'll have a proper chat. And I think part of that was with the fact that telephone consultations are usually characteristically very short, but it was also kind of, I felt that really to get a gauge of somebody from a mental health perspective, you really need to have that face-to-face interaction. And I still believe that to some degree, but I think like Kimberly says, I've been really surprised by how effective the mental health consultation can be without that. And I think that probably speaks to, you know, I guess we get comfortable with certain ways of consulting ourselves. And while our patients and our clients are also adjusting to a new way of doing things, we're also adjusting to a new way of doing things as well. And I think that can be a really difficult process for people as practitioners as well. So it's really interesting to kind of have to embrace those things, because it forces us to give things a chance that we might otherwise not do. So
I actually think in some respects it's possibly easier to open up online. And I work with, obviously not specifically mental health, but with clients online and offline. And I actually find that the offline clients often open up a bit more because there is that bit of a barrier. I think it's, in some ways, it could be a good way, at least for some people, to open up a little bit. Yeah,
I think that's true. What do you guys think about that?
So I found mixed things, because obviously if I've got a new patient, obviously a lot of people will say, I've never struggled with mental health difficulties. And then during the last couple of months, suddenly all these feelings come to the forefront that mean that they're accessing our service. And for new patients, I think it's near on impossible to do a review or an assessment over the phone. And I actually bring them in. But then the other barrier that I'm facing is I'm wearing PPE whilst I'm talking to a new patient, which again, that's a barrier in itself. So it's trying to sort of make the best of a bad situation, really. For the people that I know really well, actually it's made not that much difference, because generally face-to-face consultations, I kind of get a sense of what their tone is, you know, if they're more talkative than normal, or, you know, there's certain characteristics that might, for me, suggest that they're struggling or that they're on a good day. So for the ones that I know very well, it's less of a problem. But I think for the new ones, I'm still trying to suss them out, which means that actually I do need that face-to-face contact to begin to build a picture of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that some of the clients that come in to see us have found is that trying to find an appropriate space at home can be a barrier in itself. So like finding an appropriate space where you're not getting interrupted. Let's say you're living with multiple people, some of who you might not know, or someone might not know that you're maybe in therapy or seeing somebody in this regard. And there's obviously a lot of shame that can come with that, and there's a lot of stigma around it. So I found that some of the people who won't find an appropriate space or can't find an appropriate space have had to put something on pause, because like some of our clinics have closed down, and we've had to find like alternatives for that. So that's one of the barriers. I think that can come specifically maybe with mental health more so than in maybe the fitness area.
Yeah, and I would kind of, in between those things, I think it's half and half, so that it depends a little bit on where the person is in terms of their defenses, so that if the person feels as though actually they have to put a limit on how much they can open up or break down, because then they have to pull themselves together because they've got to commute to get back to, you know, and they've got to get on the tube and they don't want to be teary or upset, then actually for those people, being at home really has been quite helpful, because they feel, you know, they're in their safe space already, they're very, very comfortable. I think where it's tricky is with the distraction. So even if you know, you're in your bedroom, you might be looking out the window, there's something going on, you're tapping on your something in your hands, whereas one of the key and core parts of therapy is full and focused attention, you know, that it's just you and me in a room, we're thinking together about what's going on for you, and you know that there are little demands on your attention even in your own bedroom, for example.
And I guess something that's been really interesting for me around that has been realizing how much I actually love what I do in terms of work with mental health, because it is being with that person in that moment. And so, as Sarah said, like particularly for new clients or clients who are really unwell, potentially, it actually has been quite difficult. And I've kind of realized how much in an assessment or in a clinic appointment with someone, I do kind of, you know, even though there's that physical space between the chairs and things, obviously, you know, I've realized how much that kind of presence and contact in that moment with the person is, in terms of making them feel comfortable and building that rapport. And so it's been really interesting taking it all online and over the telephone, because I've noticed some of that kind of non-verbal expression type stuff and that rapport building can get a little bit lost, and it is difficult for some people, I think, to not be there with the person physically. So yeah, it's a really interesting time for mental health work.
No, absolutely. And kind of speaking on that and touching a bit on what Joe mentioned earlier, Kimberly, what are the common sort of themes that you're sort of seeing psychologically among your clients, and on a broader scale among people on social media, like the general public? What kind of what are people struggling with, do you think, the most at the moment?
I think the main thing, and it seems of course very obvious, is the anxiety. But I think that's particularly people who didn't expect themselves to feel anxious. So there were the people who already knew they were anxious, and people who were a bit worried about it to start with, and those were the people who were taking the advice and sending in messages, and all those live Q&As we did 5 or 6 weeks ago were fully on board. But then I think there were a second group of people who kind of felt on top of things, or that their life wasn't going to change very, very much. People who perhaps already work from home, or that there wasn't a huge shift in their lifestyle because of the lockdown, but now they're experiencing different manifestations of anxiety. And I think this is one of the things, because we have a conversation about anxiety, but it seems to be quite limited in how anxiety is expressed. So people think, am I nervous? Do I have heart palpitations? Am I, hyperventilating? But we know that anxiety gets expressed in lots of different ways. So people now struggling with their sleep, people finding themselves very, very distracted. They can't focus, they can't read a book, they can't sit down for very long. People who just have completely lost motivation. Maybe they used to love running, they would go several times a week. Now they've got absolutely no motivation to do those things. Dreams have gone absolutely haywire, all of this sort of stuff. So I think it's these kind of secondary, lesser known manifestations of anxiety that are kind of creeping up on people, and they're suddenly having to think, oh, actually, perhaps I'm a little bit more vulnerable than I thought I was. So I think that's what I'm seeing, that people are expressing lots of different, I guess I would call them symptoms, not knowing what they are, and then I'm, sit down and say, could this be anxiety? So.
And how do people tend to? Sorry,
I was just going to say on that point, do you often feel at the moment, I think there's two, obviously talking about mental health is a brilliant thing, but there's often people who I think confuse being anxious with having anxiety, possibly because it's...
I'm smiling because me and Sarah have quite a few conversations about this. I think as a mental health practitioner, we always want to be quite clear, and I think it's the reason I got much more serious online as well, is that we have to, yes, it's really important for us to be having a conversation about mental illness. I think it's incredibly important for us to be reducing the stigma around mental illness and reducing the idea that it's shameful. Your brain is a physical organ. It gets sick in the same way that other physical organs get sick and deserves attention on parity with that. But I think where things have gone slightly skew with is the kind of pathologizing of normal and actually quite healthy reactions to things, so that what we might call normal nervousness or even normal sadness get labeled as anxiety disorders or depression. And I think the risk with that is that actually what it does is to undermine people's resilience. If you think every time I get nervous, I've got an anxiety disorder, then actually you're thinking of yourself as much more unwell than you might be. And my concern, my worry is that if lots of people are doing that, then actually they are kind of eroding their normal, their mental health by thinking or telling themselves or being told by the rest of the world or social media that they're actually much more unwell than they really are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've talked about quite a lot on the podcast, actually, is that it is sometimes hard to get that balance between telling everybody it's okay to talk about mental health and wanting people to talk about mental health, and then getting all of this sort of space, I think, particularly on social media, where a lot of people want to be relatable. So they'll talk about their experience with mental health problems, but then perhaps they are, they're talking about situations where, they haven't actually necessarily suffered with a genuine mental health problem or a diagnosis. They've simply had some anxiousness, like you say, and then all of their followers are reading that and going, oh my goodness, I suffer with anxiety too, because I've had exactly that same experience. And, do you think that, sort of speaking, let's ask Kieran about this, because you mentioned about mental health advocacy and reducing stigma. What's your, how do you balance that fine line between talking about it enough and not talking about it too much, or encouraging people to over self-diagnose and things like that?
Yeah, I think it can be really tricky, and like Kimberly said, it's it's a bit of a fine line, and things maybe have gone a bit askew in some sense. But I think something that I find really interesting, especially in the online social media kind of world, is this, again, like Kimberly said, this referencing anything that is not an amazing positive experience or emotion as being somehow abnormal or not welcome. So I think as a society and as communities now, any kind of unpleasant emotion or experience is often kind of tagged now as being very wrong, very unhealthy, and maybe part of a mental illness. And I think part of the advocacy around mental health that I really love is looking at it and trying to bring it closer to some of the ways that we think about and talk about physical health and fitness. you know, because we talk about our body and our physical health as something that we can, you know, that has some positive and negative states, but it's all health, and that we can put things into daily to kind of keep us on par and boost us from baseline. But I mean, we don't have that same kind of sense when it comes to mental health. I think we get very caught up in, this is what, you know, I need to be thinking and feeling if I'm mentally healthy, and if I'm feeling any of the other stuff, it must mean that something's wrong with me or that I have a mental illness, when really, I mean, for any of us, even if we've never experienced mental illness per se before, feeling a bit anxious right now, feeling low right now, feeling isolated, worried, that's not abnormal necessarily. And I guess if I've ever been asked to talk about, you know, when do things reach a level where it would classify as a mental illness? I mean, I guess each diagnosis is different, but in our diagnostic manual, it often has a tagline of whether it is significantly impacting the person to the point where they're significantly affected and or they're not able to perform their daily kind of routines and things as they normally would to a significant degree. And so I think we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about sort of the lower spectrum of anxiety and mental health struggles, because those things are very normal, and it's part of the brain, and it's part of being a human. So
okay, that's awesome. I mean, another thing that I sort of wanted to ask about, and again, I think a lot of the people watching will be homeschooling kids and stuff at the moment. And so maybe Sarah, as someone who's kind of specializing in kids and adolescents and young people, what are the main sort of considerations that you think, you know, parents should be thinking about? I know this is a massively broad sort of open-ended question, but, you know, a lot of people will be worrying about, you know, their kids not being able to socialize with other kids and all of that sort of stuff, and being out of school. And I've seen a lot of posts on social media basically saying, you know, if you're keeping your children fed and alive, you're doing enough. You know, what kind of advice can you give to parents at the moment in what's going on?
I think the first thing to say, and it's probably the most used adjective in the last couple of months, is that this is an unprecedented situation. This is really unusual circumstances, and I think that parents need to take a step back and acknowledge that first and foremost. And actually, what are your kids going to remember this time for? They're going to remember it as time with you, because actually, when has there been an opportunity when we've been able to spend time with kids at home, free from any sort of distractions in terms of work or the sort of the rat race of commuting? I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. I think often the parents that I am seeing are trying to recreate the school day, and that's a near on impossible task, because they're trying to recreate the school day on top of doing their day-to-day job. You know, they're still working full-time, part-time. They've still got the distraction of conference calls coming through. And I think it's important to strike a balance. And whilst a lot of people might say, actually, routine's not helpful for me, I think for the vast majority, some semblance of a routine in the day is really important. And it's not to say that if you don't stick to it, the day's a write-off and you failed, but it's just to say that actually, this is what is really important that we do today. And this is what's important for each member of the family to have achieved by the end of the day. And if we've managed to tick that off, then we've done a good job. So one of the tools that I developed is something called Prepare. So it's about, at the start of the day, sitting down as a family and getting a pen, paper, and planning the day ahead. R is about routine. So even though you've not got to go anywhere, the most exciting trip out might be a trip to the supermarket to stand in a queue, but actually the routine of, you know, showering, having breakfast, getting up on time, keeping your sleep pattern, avoiding this pattern of trying to go to bed late and waking up late, actually wherever possible, trying to keep your old routine in place, I think is really, really important. And then think exercise. So I know a lot of parents are starting their day with sort of the PE teacher of the nation, Joe Wicks, and his workout, which I think is really important because it does set you up. And it's moving away from this idea that exercise is for an aesthetic purpose, but actually it's about preparing you mentally for the day ahead, improving your concentration, improving sleep, improving your mood. So something that you can do as a family together. P is about prioritizing. So what is important for each member of the family to have done that day? So for you as someone that's working, it might be that you have to have a Zoom call at 2 p.m. and no member of the family is allowed to disturb you during that time. For your child, it might be that they read at least one book that day, or that they sit down and they do their phonics, or they have a catch up with one of their mates online. So outlining the priorities for each member of the family in the day. A is about avoiding social media notifications. I know I'm guilty that I spend far too much on my phone. I'm getting pulled into Twitter chats. And actually that's really distracting. That raises anxiety levels. So agreeing check-ins at the day. So the 5 p.m. government announcement might be a good one. You know, you can decide what media outlet you trust. That doesn't raise your anxiety level too much. R is about reaching out, so maintaining those social connections. So as a family, you might be, you know, not going to barbecues that you used to on a weekend or kids' parties. So making sure that you maintain those social connections. They may look and feel very different, but they're hugely important to maintain all the same. And E is about eating well and keeping hydrated. So the reason I created the Prepare checklist is actually they're all pretty basic things to do. They're all very subjective. You know, no one's saying you have to do X, Y, and Z, but you're agreeing as a family what's important for each member and what is going to demonstrate success to the day. You know, whilst schools are sending out things to complete, I think the underlying statement from most schools is wherever possible, you know, and actually being realistic with the resources that you have at home. And actually, if your kid's going to be distracted and they're going to be on their iPad playing and they're content, but you've fed them, you've watered, you know, all of that, then, you know, you've aced it, you've aced the day. So I think it's important to be self-compassionate, to realise that actually every child in this country is going through exactly the same experience. Every parent in this country is going through exactly the same experience. And to make the best of a bad situation would be my underlying advice.
That's awesome. And I think what's really interesting about it is that we see a lot of people talking about their experience of lockdown as though their experience is what everybody else is experiencing. And it's something, because it's something that we've touched on, like Dan, for example. You know, like a lot of people have gone from, you know, going to work every day and then being furloughed and having nothing to do, so having to fill their day with stuff. And then you've got, you know, like Dan, for example, has suddenly become like a school teacher and doing all the childcare and having to work from home, and your wife having to work from home as well. So like there are such vastly differing experiences, aren't there? And I think it's so important. And like Dan, for example, can I ask you, like, you know, when you look at things like social media and you see people talking about, and it's often the most active influencers on social media talking about stuff are like, you know, the young, healthy, single people who don't have an awful lot of responsibilities in the background, talking about, oh yeah, you know, you should be using this time to achieve everything. And do you think that's putting a slightly unfair pressure on people to be?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's an element of almost parent shaming. Is you've got those that, you know, splash it all over social media. We've got this scheduled at 7 a.m, this scheduled at 9 a.m. And broadly speaking, a lot of parents, they are just coping day to day. But you also have this, the happy clappy element is, we all know social media is a show reel, but you don't, as it's all very well knowing that, but it'd be nice to see and refreshing to see some of the people that are really struggling with it, because some days are a real struggle. And we spoke about it briefly when Joe came on, but you've got this almost toxic positivity element in that we should feel a certain way all the time, but days are tough, like, as a parent.
I think some of that stems from even the language that people use online, and it's not always helpful. The kind of should and shouldn't.
Yeah.
Like, it insinuates that there is a right way of doing things, and for people giving out parenting advice saying that you should do it this way and you shouldn't do other things is, you know, it's not that helpful right now. And I think that applies more broadly across the spectrum, because what I'm seeing in terms of the health behavior side of things, people saying, oh, you know, I'm turning to food a lot. And that's not inherently bad. And people are saying, oh, I'm you know, I've taken up this behavior and I'm not particularly happy about it. But I think, like Sarah said, it's like being compassionate with yourself right now, because there is no right or wrong way of doing it. And I think if we can get to the end of this and not be in maybe a worse situation than we were before, we're doing okay, just to kind of get through it and survive.
Yeah, and on the super productivity front, it does seem to be almost a little bit of a competition online as well, because I certainly find I've actually got less time than ever. I get to the end of the day and I'm actually more exhausted than ever. So it's, you know, I'm not going to be too judgmental, but it does bother me slightly, grown adults complaining that they're bored when some of us have got less time than ever.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's someone's just said on the comments, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And I think it's I can't remember actually. I think it was,
she sent me that the other day. I think
it was
really
Rebecca
good.
Coyne. Yeah, I think it's a really good example. And kind of speaking on that, like I wanted to extend that question, like if we think about it from like a societal point of view with regards to things like health inequalities and stuff like that, what do you think are kind of the most important things that the government should be focusing on and considering in terms of planning resources and things for people to ensure that the mental health generally and well-being of society kind of remains intact? I suppose I'm going to start that one off with Kimberly, if possible, please.
Sure. What I think I saw that article, the storm quote as well, and I think it's really key. And what this crisis has really made clear is how and who is much more vulnerable to being harmed by the crisis than others. You know, that we know, for example, that Black and minority ethnic people make up less than 20% of the NHS, but they're nearly 70% of the casualties at the moment in terms of frontline staff. And that's thought to be because they have more underlying health factors, are more likely to live in crowded and overcrowded housing in multi-generational households. And so it's really showing us very starkly through the death rates how Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are at greater risk and experiencing greater inequalities across our society. And the NHS and society more generally is going to have to really get on board with that, because if people are more likely to die from something because they're poor, then that's something that a society like ours, which is one of the wealthiest in the world, really ought to be taking very seriously. So I think it's going to be thinking about understanding the increased mental health risk factors for Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities, and actually trying to get through in terms of finding them, because one of the complaints that comes up quite a lot is actually there are cultural issues in terms of how these communities respond to mental health and the stigma of mental health. Yes, perhaps, and that's true, but then the priority is on the healthcare provider to make it more accessible. So I think there needs to be an assessment of the risk, there needs to be an assessment of the causes of the inequalities of that risk, and then finding ways to make the support appropriate and accessible for these communities.
Cool. I'm going to ask the same question to Joe, if possible, please, as well.
Yeah, I think I'd like to see the messages around it normalized. I'd like to see getting mental health support as part of the process of recovering from this, because we spoke earlier about like meeting the criteria for a diagnosis, for example, and I feel like this is such a unique situation and has had an impact on, for example, people who haven't had that predisposing maybe mental health issue or comorbid mental health issue that has maybe already been diagnosed. Even those people might find this difficult. And I think part of the transition from where we are now in lockdown and getting back to normal, it seems appropriate that mental health support should be seen as maybe part of the process. So I'd love the kind of government message to be very supportive of this. This is something that would be really helpful if you've struggled during lockdown or you've struggled with that. I know that, like Kimberly said, accessibility is always an issue. It's mental health is hugely underfunded in Ireland, and I'm not sure about the UK, but it's very difficult to access services. We've seen like millions and billions being put into economic stimulation. I would love something similar to obviously be put forward for mental health.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Sorry.
No, Karen.
I think it's a really interesting point that a lot of people who, and this has been touched on by many people who didn't have a pre-diagnosed mental health condition, have now realised, or potentially, I guess, especially as we're sort of within the fitness industry here, so many people use exercise as their way of dealing with anxiety or dealing with low mood or just their sort of escapism. And now that they've they've maybe not lost it, but they have lost like the friends at the gym, the social contact they get there, the headspace they get there. And potentially they're around people all the time, which can be very draining as well. But there doesn't seem to be the support there now. So when you go to your GP, I mean, I'm not sure if this is 100% true, but I know, for example, things I've been waiting for with back pain clinics, you can't even be put on the waiting list. It's like, well, when all this is over, we can then start like rolling forward again. So that's the sort of people I'm worried about. And the people that are already working with you guys and already getting support are potentially the people that have the best like equipment there to deal with it already, or because they've been working with you, they have coping strategies and they are very self-aware and reflective, and they have you to guide them as well at this time. So that's the sort of population that I feel potentially aren't getting what they need at the moment.
I know we spoke about that the last time I was on a couple of weeks ago, and I think you're right in that a lot of our natural kind of support systems and coping strategies have been taken away by lockdown maybe. But when I was on a couple of weeks ago, we talked about like sitting with your feelings. And I think maybe our lives pre-coronavirus and pre-lockdown were, for a lot of people, so busy that they would struggle to find time in the day. And maybe now some people have found that maybe sitting with their own feelings and kind of being with themselves a lot and not having those things in their life, they maybe realize that that they might struggle with that. And it's kind of this lockdown and like being alone with themselves has kind of maybe given them an opportunity to see what that's like. And maybe some things or some difficult things have come up for them. And what I see, I guess, in my own practice is people expressing it in relation to smoking or alcohol or food or exercise, like you said.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, because I think what's happened in the health service, speaking from a general medical perspective, is that there's been this huge diversion of resources to simply dealing with coronavirus. And what that's meant is that we've sent out, either consciously or subconsciously, sent out a message to everybody very early on in the process. And in hindsight, it was the correct thing to do at the time because of the impending disaster that was happening at that stage. And that message was, this is now the only thing that matters. If there's anything else wrong with you, we'll deal with it later. And I think what has come to pass is that we will be dealing with this, with the coronavirus part of it for quite a longer time at perhaps a lower level than we were expecting, but still some capacity. And so what we've got to make sure happens is that we are also addressing all of the other health problems, because, there's a lot of evidence from previous pandemics that the deaths often rise from other conditions unrelated to the pandemic itself, because people aren't seeking help, etc. So there's been a lot of stuff out trying to get people to seek help again. But I agree with you, Emma, because what's often happening to those people is now they are seeking help, and then there are these dead ends in things like, memory assessment services have been suspended, so people can't get into things like dementia clinics and stuff like that. Although, it's just that the net has been narrowed, I suppose, I think is part of it. So certain referral processes have changed, but I think that is under constant review. So I'm hopeful that things are starting to open up now. So my advice to those people would be, if they think that they've got something that's in the background waiting to be dealt with, maybe touch base with your GP again, and they can tell you how things are changing, because I think that is something important. And sort of speaking on long-term effects and sort of talking about the future and other effects of this pandemic, something that's interested me is thinking about how, I guess, again, particularly with young people, but also with everybody, are we going to see a rise in other slightly related mental health conditions, things like OCD, sort of germophobia, people worrying about going out, agoraphobia, people just being, less sociable? What do we think the future holds in terms of the mental health side of things? I'm going to start with Kieran for that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, because, obviously we're in the throes of at the moment noting the mental health impacts of lockdown and being more isolated and things. But I do think that there are going to be some equal kind of rebound effects of coming back out again. And I think a lot of people will be quite anxious about that whole process. And I think it will particularly hit certain groups. You know, for example, I was talking to my grandma on the phone the other day, and she was sort of saying that she's already feeling quite anxious about when they're allowed to go out again, because she sort of said, well as an older person, or maybe someone with health conditions that put them as being more vulnerable of COVID. I mean, that's sort of that anxiety around, well, can I go out, and when, and how close should I get to people? And I think all of that is going to definitely be a part and parcel of moving through. And I guess the thing to remember is that any change is quite stressful on the mind, and that can include positive changes too. I think when we have to adjust to something or get used to a new normal, it can kind of throw everything from our sleep to our mood to our anxiety to our normal routine out. And that is probably going to be the case when we start to kind of unlock again and come back out. I think it has been interesting this period of time in terms of, I mean, you mentioned germophobia and OCD and things, and I don't know what the others might have sort of experienced in this, but it's been really interesting. Some of the patients that I have or have seen with OCD and things, they've actually really, in an odd way, felt quite safe and validated at the moment. It's been a really interesting thing that I've seen from some people in terms of, well, I told you that hand washing and not going out or touching anyone was what we all needed to be doing. So in some ways, it's kind of reinforced a lot of those things. So again, coming back out of that again is probably going to be quite difficult for patients already moving through those kind of anxieties and struggles too. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of rebound sort of stuff happening as we move through into a new phase as well.
What I initially thought of when I heard the question was post-traumatic stress and those kind of symptoms, because it's not really in my wheelhouse. That's not an area that I specialize in, but I have read about the post-traumatic stress symptoms from things like natural disasters, and I know we talked about it the last time I was on the podcast. I would be interested to hear if you guys maybe think that this is considered maybe a traumatic experience or enough to maybe have that pendulum swing back and maybe have some post-traumatic stress related symptoms after this is over.
I think it's important to say that no event individually in and of itself is traumatic. The assessment of trauma is based on the person's individual experience and their capacity to cope, so that two people can be in the same situation. I mean, there are some events that happen to people that we can call traumatic, but in terms of this, there will be some people who perhaps in the exact same situation, let's call it an earthquake, who will be okay, and there will be some people who will be traumatized by it, and that will be dependent on their baseline level of coping and their capacity and their resilience. And those things can be affected by other things like their physical health before the event happened, any other stressful events that were going on in their lives, their childhood experiences, and all of that sort of stuff. I also just want to say that we should be clear as mental health professionals that most people will be okay. Like, I don't want the message to be going out to people watching this thinking that they're likely or they can expect themselves to be traumatized by this situation. What we know about many, many, many stressful events and difficult experiences and natural disasters is that humans are fundamentally resilient, and we do adapt, even to the most extreme of circumstances. And so the vast majority of people will have weird adjustments, and it will be a bit odd, and I think there will be some trepidation about what it means to return to normal. But most people, there's a natural resiliency that kicks in. And what we know, for example, is that what isn't helpful is, after a natural disaster, to immediately send down like truckloads of therapists to get people to start talking about their trauma, about their pain, because it actually undermines resilience. And so what we're wanting to be doing is allowing time for people's natural resilience to kick in, natural human resilience to kick in, but also identifying the people who might be more vulnerable. So thinking about those people perhaps who are going to be at risk financially, or perhaps have lost their housing, or their housing is insecure, people who have less support available to them that might be more vulnerable to the pressures of that stress. those are the people that we need to be identifying and making sure their resources are to support them. So I just don't want that message to go out that anybody watching this, that, you know, you will be traumatized by this because it's a traumatic experience. Most people are going to be okay after a period of adjustment.
I want to absolutely, I wholeheartedly agree with that, Kimberly. And I suppose one of the things that I think is really important is to empower people that actually they have got the skills themselves within them to manage those sort of low-level symptoms. So as an example, I was finding last week, my husband, every time I woke up in the morning, I'd be in a good mood and he'd be on Twitter and like reporting at the latest death count. I'm like, right, that's just set my mood off for the day. Instantly, I know that that's not helpful for me, and it's something that I can change by saying, look, I don't need a daily report of the death count from you first thing in the morning. And a simple way of doing that is I talk about sort of the 5 sense method. So I ask people, if you're feeling a bit out of sorts, you know, a bit down, a bit anxious, ask yourself, is there anything that I've seen, heard, felt, smelt, or tasted in the last 24 hours, the last few days that could explain why I'm feeling the way I am? So for me, I know that hearing my husband blare on about the death count is not helpful. So I can immediately change that behavior by saying, look, no more. If you want to look at Twitter, you go to a separate room, and I don't want you to talk to me about the death count. I was finding that I was feeling a bit more nervy on an evening, and it's because the kettle is right there. So I'm constantly backwards and forwards, you know, having bats of sort of teas and coffees throughout the day. So a change that I can make myself is actually having a caffeine curfew. Again, things like screens, I think my screen use, I know for a fact, has shot up dramatically in the last couple of months. A change that I can make is actually keeping a tab on my screen use. What am I using it for? How does it make me feel? If I'm finding that, you know, scrolling social media is just making me feel inadequate, feeling that I've just wasted this last 2 months because I didn't write my 3rd book or whatever it may be, then actually maybe checking out of social media, curating my social media feed. If actually people are saying that you know, say if I've not exercised, because normally my routine is going to the gym. I enjoy going to the gym. I enjoy being around people, but making adaptations that mean that I'm still moving every day. So it's a really, really simple tool. And, you know, I already have created myself a sort of a self-help toolkit, which is how I monitor my screen use, how I monitor what comes out of my husband's mouth, how I monitor my caffeine intake. And actually, I think empowering people in that way is hugely important, because it's going to be those small changes that in the long run will be hugely, hugely beneficial. And again, just to pick up on Kimberly's point, you know, most of us will be fine coming out of this. And actually, if you're able to check in with yourself daily and to notice those subtle changes in your mood, the things that tip you into, you know, a bad day, the things that actually lift your mood, and developing your own sort of self-help toolkit, I think is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, I totally agree. And how you react, sorry.
Sorry, Matt. I was going to say, I just really, really agree with that. And I probably sounded like a bit of a grim reaper before when I was like, we're anxious in isolation, we're going to be anxious out of isolation. Definitely not the case. And I love that and completely agree, because again, I think it's taking this ethos on board of kind of being able to feel empowered about our mental health in the same way we can about our physical health and fitness. You know, we know and do all of these things to keep our body ticking over and feeling a bit better, and we adjust our workout routine and start running instead of treadmilling at the gym. And I mean, just like you guys said as well, I think we can start plugging some basic things into every day to have that same kind of viewpoint and the same kind of outcome when it comes to just helping our mind stand on a little bit more steady ground to get us through this as well. So yeah, definitely agree.
I also think that a really important thing that Sarah mentioned is communication. And I was just actually checking that my sister is watching this, because the other day, my sister's someone that very much thrives on finding as much information as possible. And the other day in fact, it was a couple of weeks ago, and I was feeling okay for probably the first time since this all had started. And I was ringing my sister on the way home from work, and I was about to have a few days off, and I was like, I actually feel okay. Everything's fine. And the first thing she said was, did you see today's numbers? And I just, instead of saying, exactly like Sarah said, I don't, this doesn't help me. It's not, it's not great for me to know this kind of stuff. I just erupted and we had this massive row. I was like, why did you have to tell me the numbers? She was like, why would I think that you don't know the numbers? And it was all just, we can communicate these things without, we have to remember that not everybody else is in our own minds and is realizing what it is that we're anxious about. So we need to try and communicate those things effectively to each other. So Nadine, if you're watching, I'm sorry, I was moody.
That's great, guys, because a lot of that is very much around monitoring ourselves. I just wanted to get your opinions, if possible, in terms of our responsibility to take care of others and watching out for symptoms. Have they suffer with particularly low mood? Is their behaviour slightly different? And with children as well, because just using mine as an example, her sleep, she's regressed with her sleep pattern. She has moments where she's kind of sat quietly, which for normally quite a bubbly child is concerning sometimes. Is there anything we should be looking out for others?
So I always use a tool sort of called the day in the life of, and I always actually use my daughter as the example with this. So my daughter is 5, and the reason I use her as an example is just to prove that you can do this with anyone, whether it's a family member, someone that you work with, someone that you check in daily, a work colleague, for instance. So my daughter will bound into our bedroom bright and early, 6 o'clock in the morning, whether it's Monday to Friday or Saturday or Sunday. And she's normally quite chirpy and chatty, and she normally tries to get one of us out of bed to read her a story. Then we'll go downstairs, she'll demolish her breakfast, she'll want to watch something on TV, normally Paw Patrol or whatever it may be. And generally her temperament, she's quite a happy child. Like she can be whingy, but I know that that's normally around sort of meal times. When I drop her off at school, she's normally quite content to see me go, sort of wave me off at the door. And the teachers, generally, I don't hear anything from them during the day. And then I pick her up and she tells me about her day, and we get home and again, watching TV. I'm a real advocate for TV, sort of TV nanny. And then we'll have our meal, and then she'll go to bed, settle quite easily, and then sleep, and generally gets up maybe once in the night. So the reason I've said that is if I was noticing that she wasn't coming into my room until 8 o'clock in the morning, if I noticed that it was a real effort to get her changed, that she was off her food, that she didn't have the same level of enjoyment from her usual TV program, that trying to, prize her out of the house to take her to school was just, a really impossible task, that she was crying when she was waving me off, that the teachers were ringing me several times in the day. So you get the impression that actually very, very quickly, something that seems very kind of mundane, there's subtle changes that indicate that something's wrong, whether or not it's that she's physically feeling unwell or mentally feeling unwell. So what I would ask people to do is think about what are your baselines, because obviously it all look very different now because kids are not accessing school. So what are the usual patterns? What do you normally expect from different members within your household or within your family, or even your friends? Is your friend no longer checking in on a house party on a Friday night, or are they drinking a lot more, or are they not picking up their phone? So drawing out those baselines, I think, is hugely important, and any deviation from that baseline, I think, invites a conversation. So again, I'm going to share another tool of mine, something called Face Fear. So if, for instance, you had a mate that you checked in on every day via FaceTime or Zoom, or a work colleague, and you were noticing that they were just absent, they weren't bothering to check in. So wherever possible, have a face-to-face conversation. So it might be that you have a one-on-one conversation with them, and you notice that they're a bit disheveled, that they seem a bit more quiet than normal. I would ask, sort of keep those observations in mind, but invite them to ask, what's going on? I'm a bit worried about you. How are you at the moment? If they say, I've just spotted Mike's t-shirt, I'm fine, actually encouraging them to open up. If they're still saying, look, I'm absolutely fine, then the important thing then is the sort of the fear aspect, which is the facts. What have you noticed? I've noticed that you're not joining the lads on the FaceTime chat, or I'm noticing that you don't appear showered, you're drinking more than normal, you're a bit more snappy. Now, if I was to reel off to you a list of things that I'd noticed that was different about you, your instant reaction might be one of being quite defensive. What do you mean? No, I'm fine. Again, repeating that phrase. But it's about putting it into context. So you were the first to log into house party normally. you were someone that you didn't normally drink X amount per day, it's very rare that you're irritable with me. You used to be bounding into my bedroom at 6 o'clock in the morning. So again, putting it into context of what's usual pattern for that person's behavior. And then the A and the R is about agreeing an action and reviewing. So actually empowering that person to say, look, I'm really worried about you. I know you're saying you're fine, but I'm worried for the reasons that I've given. What can we do that means that we can kind of get things back on track? Now, it might be that they've broken up with a partner, or it might be that they've been furloughed. You know, there might be something that might explain the change of behavior, in which case you might expect that change might be quite temporary. But it's about making sure that you check in regularly, not to say we've had the conversation, tick, you know, we've done our bit, but about empowering that person to say, right, okay, I'm worried about you. We'll check in every evening and we'll see how you're getting on. And if things aren't better, then this is what we're going to do. So setting out, you know, sort of quite clear action points. So for instance, my daughter, for her, it might be that she's missing her friends. And it might be the agreed action might be, okay, we're going to FaceTime your friend every week to make sure that you see your friend. And actually what I might find is that she seems a bit bright, you know, happier. She's interested in her food again. So it's about empowering again people to make those simple changes that will help the situation.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Dan and Emma, do we have any burning questions from the audience?
Nothing specific. They're all quite specific. The ones that have
I think personal ones are probably not going to be.
I don't know whether you guys might feel comfortable answering those. Perhaps if you want to review them afterwards. I don't want to ask them out loud just in case you're not comfortable with it.
Sure.
I think in terms of signposting, that might be quite helpful for people that don't have the accessibility, or they perhaps don't feel comfortable going to their GPs. Are there any other charities, or are there any other bodies out there that people can call on?
I think first and foremost, what I would say is, you know, GP, your usual healthcare professional, would be ideally the most, you know, first point of call. And to pick up on an earlier point, that actually services are continuing to run, but they may look and feel very different. So, you know, if you are under mental health services already, your first point of call would be your mental health professional. Absolutely. I suppose there are lots and lots of voluntary agencies. I'm mindful that I don't want to kind of miss any out, but I mean, obviously Samaritans is an obvious choice if someone is really, really struggling with their mental health. Young Minds for sort of children, young people, Mind. So I suppose it depends on what input you're wanting. I don't know, Kimberly, whether you had any pearls of wisdom.
Well, no, all the ones that would be normally listed. I would also, just as a kind of final reminder, just remind people that that you do have an opportunity to have some influence on your mental health. Your brain is a physical organ, so all of those things which you get told all the time, which sound very boring, are actually really important. So adequate nutrition, we know that adequate nutrition can reduce your risk of stress and PTSD. So really eating well, taking care of your sleep, trying to get some natural light, and staying connected really are really effective at reducing your risk of coming out of this worse. So don't neglect those things. Self-care actually is really important.
Excellent, thank you.
I totally agree. And I'd just add to that as well. Even if you seek help from the wrong place in the first port of call, if they can't help you, they will usually be able to guide you in the right direction of someone who can. So even if if you ring up the GP and they've got no appointments, even the receptionist will be able to tell you who you can contact instead. Or if you do speak to the GP and the GP doesn't think they can help you, they will be able to help, to tell you who you can contact instead. So I think the important thing is to seek help, because generally, even if you don't seek it from the perfect place, they'll be able to guide you to where to seek it from. So I think we're coming to the end of that. Well, we've gone slightly over on our time. So thank you so much, guys, for joining us for that.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Really, really awesome. We really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us. And we will catch you soon, I'm sure, on other podcasts, and hopefully an actual real life event sometime soon. And I'm just gonna put this out there now. Kimberly, you are going to be official baker for this event. Just
absolutely, sure thing.
So you're aware.
I'll let you have that one. I can't bake.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we heard it here first.